So, what is a drug, right? This is a class about drugs. A drug is a chemical. Literally, like, you know, you're made up of chemicals, right? There are chemicals in your diet and food, etc. I love it when some people, you know, like to say, you know, they don't ever take drugs. They don't take chemicals. You know, they try to avoid chemicals. You know, they only have, let's say, natural products or let's say herbs. And think about it, you know, an herb is, you know, from a plant, and it's filled with chemicals, right? It's lots and lots of chemicals. And actually what's interesting about the distinction between a pharmaceutical drug, like something prepared by a pharmaceutical company, and like an herbal remedy, is that there's a lot more consistency in the pharmaceutical generally. I mean, it tends to be a purified chemical, and while an herbal, you know, source of drugs, right, or of chemicals is going to, you know, consist of a great many, and the exact, you know, concentration or ratio of various chemicals in the herb will depend upon, you know, how the herb was grown, the soil it was grown in, the amount of water it gets. There's a great deal of variability in, you know, the amount of chemical you're exposing yourself to, you know, with one herbal preparation to the next. So anyway, what do these chemicals do when they get into your, you know, nervous system or into your body? We make a distinction in psychopharmacology between drug action and drug effect. And generally what you're thinking about when you think about the effects of drugs, right, are literally the drug effects. Like cocaine will, you know, speed up your heart and will, you know, get you to move more and, you know, give you a feeling of pleasure or euphoria. These are the effects, and again, that's only initially. These are the effects of drugs. But the action of drugs is literally the drug, the chemical, you know, acting in a far more local manner at very specific places in the nervous system. And let me give you a little sense of where those places are. First, let's look at this overhead, this graphic. When it says here cell membrane, this little piece here represents a little segment of the skin of a cell. Basically of a, you know, the outer, you know, covering of a cell, which we refer to as its membrane. And we're going to learn more about the membrane. Cell membranes are unique in that they are, you know, pretty impermeable. It's difficult for substances like drugs, right, like chemicals, like charged substances. We'll learn more about ions, for example, to pass through. It's very difficult for them to get from one side to the other. So cells actually manufacture, based upon instructions in their DNA and genes, specific proteins that are then embedded into the membrane and allow for detection of events that are occurring outside the cell, right? So this is a class of protein that your cells manufactures. It's called a receptor, right? Receptors are this giant class of proteins that respond to specific chemicals that are, you know, going to be found outside the cell. And drugs are chemicals, and they can influence the function of these receptors and then influence, you know, the behavior or response of the cell. So a very important point to keep in mind in this class is that whenever one chemical interacts with another, so for example, when a drug, you know, encounters and interacts with a receptor, we often talk about it binding to the receptor. Literally, there's a spot, you know, on the receptor that seems to attract in the chemical drug, and it links up. Whenever two things meet together and, you know, form a larger structure, there's going to be a shift in the overall shape of that structure, that combined structure. So when that drug interacts with that drug-receptor complex is going to change its shape. And the change in shape here is going to have consequences for the function of the cell. Now, drug action is literally the drug, you know, let's say cocaine, binding to a particular receptor, right? The receptor will change shape, and then a change will occur. You know, drugs like cocaine actually can influence other structures too, and we'll talk about, you know, what other protein structures are influenced by cocaine. In contrast, the effect is the resultant change, you know, that occurs in cognition, behavior, mood, for example, right? And an example that's shown here is these are two drugs, atropine and morphine, and they both influence a behavior, basically the dilation of the pupil. So atropine, it turns out, will act pretty locally in the eye on, you know, receptors that are located on muscle cells in the eye, and the effect that results from that, you know, that action is dilation of the pupil. Okay, morphine, it turns out, actually acts somewhere else besides the eye. It doesn't act in the eye itself. It's in the site of drug action. The receptors at which morphine will actually, you know, act are located some distance from the eye, However, the effect that you see is, these pinpoint pupils, these very, highly constricted pupils that you'll see in the eye. That's actually one of the symptoms associated or effects associated with high levels of opiate use. The point here is that the site of drug action can sometimes be close to the site of drug effect, but it doesn't have to be. And oftentimes, the site of drug action is some distance from the site of drug effect.